to share at this time?
Well, friends, good morning. And as Pastor Tim said, he's asked me to often offer a reflection here, and it feels odd to be doing that from our own house and from our home here. It's kind of like the ultimate of phoning it in. You just kind of, I wonder where this was when I was in the pulpit many years ago. But the text, as you've heard, is the text about the story about doubting Thomas. And this is the standard text for the Sunday after Easter. Now, we've heard the story a couple of times already, but it's worth just at least remembering the timeline about why we're talking about this at the Sunday after Easter. The crucifixion was on a Friday, and 3 days after that, Jesus appeared to the disciples, and that was Easter Sunday. Now, the text tells us that Thomas was not there. It doesn't explain where he was or why he wasn't there, but he was the one who wasn't present at that time. And so it was in that week in between Easter Sunday and the next Sunday that he met with the disciples, and they told him what they had experienced. And from that then came the famous line, "Unless I see the nail marks on his hand, put my finger in the wounds left by the nails, and put my hand into his side, I won't believe." Now, the following Sunday is when Jesus appeared to Thomas. And so that's why we've kind of inherited this story on this particular Sunday. But it's that one quote, "Unless I see the nail marks, unless I put my finger in the wounds, I won't believe." And that's what marked Thomas as the doubter, as the skeptic. I don't know if you were watching in the background of the words during the reading of the scripture, but there was a lot of artwork in there. And the artwork was kind of reflecting that story. And that was actually one of the dominant themes of the artists in the Middle Ages. In fact, it had a name, The Incredulity of Thomas. And all of that work was kind of lumped into that category because it was such a prevalent story for the people in the church at that time. Jesus, do you believe because you see me? And then he says, happy are those who don't see and yet believe. And that's the part of the story we've been hearing so far. The church has referred to that as sola fide, by faith alone. And the church has taught that for centuries. Martin Luther, justification by faith. It isn't by what you do, it's by what you believe, your act of faith. It isn't by what your priest does or by anything that you can purchase on your own. It is by faith alone, sola fide. Bill Coffin was the one who always shared that piece for me that said that faith is like walking up to a precipice. And faith is the act of jumping off, and then you grow wings. It's not something that you can prove. It's something that despite whatever doubts you have, you still have to act on faith alone. Faith does not live without doubt. But given our doubts, it's when we express that faith anyhow. And friends, that's one way to tell the story. But let me go at it in a different way. And I want to point out a couple of other things. That if you take a look at the text, we've had it read, we've heard it a couple of times. And in that, one of the things I want to point out is that at no place does the text ever call Thomas a doubter. That actually comes from the church. What if, instead of being a doubter, we can begin to think about Thomas as a realist? This is one of the things that that comes out of the writing of Frederick Buechner. Buechner was one of those guys who was a biblical theologian, but he was also an exceptional Presbyterian preacher. He wrote wonderful books, particularly back in the 70s and 80s. And in one book called Peculiar Treasures, he kind of rehearses a biblical who's who. He goes through the various characters. And when he talks about Thomas, he says this. His first paragraph says, imagination was not Thomas's long suit. He called a spade a spade. He was a realist. He didn't believe in fairy tales, and if anything else came up that he didn't believe in or couldn't understand, his questions could be pretty direct. What if Thomas isn't a doubter, but he's a realist? What if he's not saying, I don't believe, but he's actually being asked to believe something that's pretty astounding? What if he simply wants to be able to test it? You know, when he asks to see the hands and the feet and the wound on the side, this is something that has already been shared with the other disciples. If you go back into the text on the 20th chapter, the 20th verse, it says that when Jesus came, he showed the disciples his hands and the wounds on his side. Commentators have always said that that was a terribly important act because it confirmed for the disciples that the very Jesus that was crucified on the cross was exactly the same Jesus that stood in front of them now. There was no trick involved. So it was confirmation. Thomas wasn't doubting. He was simply asking for what everybody else had seen. That seemed to be his nature. Thomas doesn't show up just in this part. If you go back a little bit into the 14th chapter, not the 20th chapter where we read from, but back into the 14th chapter, we have the part of the story that John tells about the last week that leads up to the crucifixion, and particularly the Last Supper. And this is where Jesus did a lot of teaching. He taught about the announcement of his betrayal, the announcement of Peter's denial, the importance of the commandment of love. And then he comes to this point at the beginning of the 14th chapter where he says, don't be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. My Father's house has room to spare. If that weren't the case, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When I go to prepare a place for you, I will return and take you to be with me so that where I am, you will be too. You know the way to the place I'm going. That's where Thomas steps back in. The next line comes from Thomas, the 5th verse. Thomas asked, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? Thomas isn't challenging Jesus. He's simply trying to figure it out. Jesus, we're hearing what you're saying, but how's this work? What do we expect? You're telling us we know the way, but what's the next step? Help us to see that. The reason I want to at least offer that other alternative is because that voice of realism is, in fact, a voice of faith. One of the things that I think that we need to do is to say that faith, even with our doubt, needs to be coupled with a hefty dose of realism about if, in fact, we do believe these things, in reality, how do they get lived out? Realism is a good thing. Some will say that the Exodus is the dominant story of the Old Testament. It has even been said it's the only story in the Old Testament. And it challenges realism at every single step along the way. The Israelites were promised that they were going to be led out of slavery in Egypt and given a promised land. They followed the promise, and then all kinds of realistic issues showed up, such as, what about this Red Sea in front of us while the Egyptians are chasing us? And what about those 40 years in the wilderness where we have to get up and we start marching off every day, but we're not really sure about which way we're going? And what about food? And what about water? Yeah, we hear about the manna and the doves and all, but who's the provider here? How are we sure it's going to happen? All this realism creeps in, which in fact, when we have the freedom to ask the questions and respond, sustains the faith. One of the things that I've been concerned about in my work over the years is that Christians and Christian congregations sometimes are not terribly heavy on realism. They are very aspirational, but aspirational sometimes in a way in which we're not realistic enough. We want to see the lion lay down with the lamb. We want justice to roll down from the mountains. We want to turn swords into plowshares. We want the church to be the holy city on top of the hill. We have all the language for it. We have all the images. We have the metaphors down. We know how to talk that way. But sometimes we get caught short by not knowing exactly how to take the first step toward that which we believe, that which we want. We don't lack aspirations, but we need realism. And that's where Thomas steps in. Yeah, you tell us we know the way, but what's the first step? Yeah, you tell us to believe, but how's it going to work? One of the reasons I think we need to pay attention to realism like that is that we have a history in which the church has not always fulfilled it. We have wanted to be the beloved community, but at the same time, this church that so much wants to be the beloved community is the same church that historically has asked African Americans either to sit in the back or up in the loft, not with the other people. Or this is the same church that told women that they couldn't take leadership and they couldn't be ordained, and hasn't included our youth and isn't comfortable with the differences. If we want to be the beloved community, then where's that voice of reality, that doubtfulness of Thomas that says, yeah, I get it, but what's the next step? And so here we are on Zoom in the middle of a pandemic. And we've been talking about that. And yes, we believe God will see us through. And yes, God holds our future. And yes, as a community of faith, we have a role to play, a purpose to fulfill in all this. What? How's it going to work? What's the next step? And so Wayne was just talking about what he shared with the children, and he was holding up cleansers and sprays and all the things that you and I are using. And we're using them as if there is a practical reason for it, and there is. But it's also a spiritual practice. And that's the part that we don't want to miss. If the church wants to be the beloved community, then we all have to lean into not what we need to do to protect ourselves, but how do we serve the common good? How do we make this right for as many people as we can? Social distancing is an act of ministry. Those expanded prayer lists that we're now carrying, those extra telephone calls that we're making, that thinking about one another is all part of stepping into the beloved community. The face masks are there not to protect us, but to protect other people. They're not comfortable. Have you figured that out yet? And so there's this way in which we are being called to be very realistic about the faith that we say we want to be able to have. And so we're even willing to trade in a sanctuary and an altar for an internet platform. And instead of feeling like we've lost something, the spiritual discipline is to say, what are we now learning and gaining from one another as we do that? So that's my reflection this morning. These are just not necessary requirements. And, you know, it requires that kind of patience about not wanting to rush back, even though we'd love to go back to restaurants and we'd love to see the economy kick back in and all that other kind of stuff. And it isn't just the impatience that a lot of us are feeling here. The way in which we need to remember and to honor the people who are in healthcare and the first providers and the people who are going in for essential businesses who are taking a risk. Lynn and I have the luxury, the convenience of being able to be together and to support one another through this. And we grouse about boredom. There's so much more. And it's all part of a spiritual practice, not the doubting side of Thomas, the realistic side. One of the things that I have searched for in my life is that faith that is coupled with realism that gives power and purpose to Easter. and to the Easter people. Amen.